This week's Inside the Lords. We're sitting inside because it's a bit cold outside, but we are at the heart of Westminster. And one of the big issues that's been preoccupying Parliament this week has been the rather dramatic intervention by the Labour Party in terms of their constitutional review. You will have noted that the headline is that we should abolish the House of Lords. And I was actually quite excited by this radical proposal put forward by Keir Starmer, written by Gordon Brown. And I think it does raise really interesting issues in terms of where democracy is going. I was slightly concerned, however, when I read through the review to discover that this isn't quite as radical as I would want it to be. I think that we should abolish the House of Lords and put the power where it belongs, in the Commons. And all of the people who argue, yeah, but the Commons write laws badly and they need to have processes to check that they're not having unintended consequences, just means that the Commons are sloppy and lazy in the way they do legislation and rely on the Lords, unelected, to sort it out for them. And that inevitably creates a democratic deficit and a problem. So I hope that if you abolish the Lords, just had the Commons, they'd get better at creating legislation that makes sense. They'd be more careful about thinking through the consequences of what they want to legislate on, but they would be the elected chamber. However, when I read the Labour Party's proposals, it's clear that they want a second chamber, and it sounds democratic because they say it'll be elected, but actually it's an elected second chamber from the nations and regions, which effectively would be an alternative seat of power to Parliament, to elected politicians, made up of effectively what would be regional or local cronies. It's not quite taking back control. It's not exactly giving power through to the Parliament. And I think that it's very important that the nation state, as the organiser of democratic accountability, is not undermined by attempts at devolution plus, which is, of course, Gordon Brown's forte. I think we've seen with what's happening in Scotland and in Wales that devolution can only lead to a dissipation of democratic power. It just means that you have people geographically closer to you, but not necessarily more democratically accountable to you. So I've got real reservations. But I want to say this. I think it is preposterous that the Conservatives would say, how dare you have this constitutional review and try and disturb the Constitution and so on. Because actually that was in the 2019 Conservative manifesto and they've never come up with anything. So, they should. And it's their fault that they've left a gap in the market. I do think that at least the Labour Party's very serious report, because it is quite long, should be read by everyone. And if it gives the basis for a discussion about democracy, all to the good. I've just done a podcast for The Spectator on this issue, which I'll be publishing. And it was quite interesting having a bit more of an in-depth discussion. At least the question is on the table. And it's interesting, and I mentioned in that podcast, that some of the people who are most hostile to Gordon Brown's plans are, wait for it, Labour Party members in the House of Lords. Because, the Labour peers like nothing else than having often wins against Tory government. So it will be interesting to see if Keir Starmer has the courage to see this through, but I'm not going to criticise him for raising the question. In terms of what's been happening in the Lords, maybe this kind of indicates some of the problems that we have. So the main focus of my work this week has been the higher education free speech bill, which was touted by the Conservative government under Boris Johnson, fair enough to start with, as the big flagship free speech legislation that they were going to bring through. And what's ironic is that I was actually quite anxious. I didn't want legislation to be used as a substitute for winning a cultural battle and a defence and positive argument for free speech or academic freedom by just using the law. I was nervous and anxious about the use of courts to remedy where you could threaten to sue universities. And guess what? I was persuaded by all of these people who were around the Conservative Party developing this bill that this was actually something worth considering. I mean, I was not persuaded by them so much, although they asked me. I was convinced by people like Professor Kathleen Stock, Professor Joe Phoenix, and some free speech campaigners who I really admire, that maybe actually this bill was necessary. You know, when Phil Cunliffe and Peter Ramsey, people who are academics who I really have a lot of time for, say, look, even though we don't like the law, we think we need this law. Then I thought, well, you know, maybe I've got to take it seriously. So I read it seriously, took it seriously, argued for it throughout committee stages. And now, just as we get to report stage, where you actually vote on amendments rather than just discussing them, the government gave way, compromised massively on the part of the bill, Part 4, that would allow academics to turn to the civil courts and sue. It's known as tort. I didn't know what it was either, but that's what it is. And they kind of collapsed. And why they collapsed? Because actually there'd been opposition in the House of Lords from crossbenchers, from some of their own backbench, and they kind of are in a very weak position. And then the Russell group of vice-chancellors of all people opposed this bill. And so they said, oh, well, we'll compromise then. We'll make civil remedy the very, very, very last resort after you've been through a long bureaucratic process, and only if you've been through that process, organised by the Office for Students. The truth is that despite what the noble Lord Grabiner suggests, vice-chancellors are not as yet queuing up to invite J.K. Rowling to speak at their universities. The suggestion that she can speak is good. Invite her, all of you. Why not? A challenge. So that's what we were debating at report stage. Of course, once you make a concession like that, particularly in the House of Lords, they smell blood. And so the opposition decided that they wouldn't accept the compromises, which were actually compromises they demanded, and they went for a total defeat of the government, arguing to remove Clause 4 completely. So there would be no remedies, no ability for any academic whose academic freedom had been compromised, who had been in any way cancelled or had any loss due to on free speech issues. They basically argued that the whole of Clause 4 should be removed. It was put to a vote, the government lost. And it serves them right, because it just shows you that if you compromise, that's what's happened. But it also shows you that the Lords can be a place that actually undermines the democratic will of the House of Commons, because it's a complete rendering of as impotent the whole basis of the bill, which was to create positive duties for academic freedom and free speech, and to protect anyone who was a victim of cancel culture. So it now goes back to the Commons. We'll see what happens, but I suppose there's a moral in that story somewhere. As with all of these things, you know, I feel so frustrated, because if I wasn't a legislator, as I am now, I would never have probably thought that we should have gone along with this legislation. I then get convinced by it, I then argue for it, and as usual, you get into a situation whereby any principle that you've got is just trashed by a very weak government. Sometimes the weakness of the government can suit me, because, you know, they just announced yesterday as well that the schools bill has been dropped completely. And you may remember, if you follow Inside the Lords, I spent an awful lot of time, many, many hours, arguing against the government schools bill, particularly the attack on homeschooling, but also on a lot of aspects of the bill which were going to centralise rather than liberate schools. Now they just dropped it. Not because they've had any principled understanding, but because they just, it seems under Rishi Sunak, don't want any trouble. And I think that the Conservative Party no longer are fit to rule. I mean, that will be decided by a general election, but their collapse internally means that you can't have any faith in them. I mean, I've never ever been a natural Conservative supporter. I simply willed on the Brexit vote of 2019 under Boris Johnson that wanted to realign politics, and the Conservative Party betrayed that and have no right or mandate any longer to claim that they should be running the country. I am less convinced than ever that the Labour Party are their natural successor, but I can't argue that they don't stand a chance like anyone else when you've got such a weak government. On the issues on free speech, as always, I go back to what happens outside Parliament as being more important. I'm about to go and give a speech in a school to a sixth form on cancel culture. I'm assured that the students will be safe from my dangerous ideas because the school has organised a safeguarding review of my invitation. How welcoming is that? And however, despite the fact that was a very irritating aspect of this invitation, I do believe that one of the roles that I can successfully play is to go and talk to young people who are disproportionately positive about cancelling people. In all of the opinion polls, that is the case. But there's also a substantial minority, if not more, of young people who don't want to feel that they have to self-censor or anxious about some of the illiberal trends. So I'm going to go and try and win the argument. But the other thing that I'm very excited about is I've just got hold of, hot off the press, literally, the new Letters on Liberty series, which is edited by Ella Whelan. And we've got three very pertinent to today. On the one hand, we've got Why Debating Matters by Mo Lovett, who is the national organiser of Debating Matters. And she explains, I think, the importance of encouraging young people in particular to debate, to see two sides of an argument, all sides of an argument, and to dig deep. But it's a really well-argued letter on liberty, which I thoroughly enjoyed. We've also got In Defence of Contrarianism, which is a great romp of a read by Ali Miraj, who is the founder of the Contrarian Prize, and who explains the importance sometimes of dissent, of kicking back, of not just going along when people tell you this is the truth. And Ali is actually the guest lecturer at the launch of the 20 initiative by Debating Matters that's happening on December the 12th, which is effectively a Christmas party organised by the charity Debating Matters, who are going to, it's their 20th anniversary, they're having a year of events. So I hope you'll come on the 12th of December and I'll advertise it underneath this and in the Substack. And join in that discussion. But we've also got mince pies and wine, and it's a chance for us to celebrate Christmas and consider how we're going to ensure that free speech survives in 2023. And the third letter on liberty is Escaping the Straitjacket of Mental Health. And this is actually very important because I was told that there was some concern by the staff team of the school that I'm going to that the students might be traumatized if they heard somebody arguing offensive ideas, and that they therefore have been given the opportunity to not attend, and they've been given a trigger warning about my arrival. Ken McLaughlin is a very important writer, is an academic who understands what real mental ill health is, and he writes an extremely important essay on how the language and the pathologized aspects of mental health, which is intended to be for those people really suffering psychosis and terribly awful problems in terms of their mind, has actually been used very broadly as a catch-all to describe people being a bit upset when they hear difficult ideas and so on. He explains it much better than I do. It's also got a great history of mental health legislation, so I recommend that you order your Letters on Liberty, subscribe to your Letters on Liberty. It's a good incentive to sign up for our Substack, because I think you get them free if you do that. Come along on December the 12th. I will be back next week, where there's the return of the Public Order Bill, where we will be finishing off the debates on the attempts by the government to ban protest, or to and over regulate and in a very draconian way protest. I'll also be talking about the arts funding and whether moving the English National Opera north will in any way be a levelling up project, or just a patronising condescension. And by then I will have given the speech I keep going on about, which is on refugees tomorrow. I've only got 6 minutes. It's hardly the most important speech I ever make, but I suppose if the House of Lords is good for nothing else, and I'll have to sit and listen to a lot of hours and hours of worthy speeches beforehand, I'll get a chance, I hope, to represent why people are worried about the small boats, and it doesn't mean that they're xenophobic or racist. So I'll be posting that on social media as well.